Opposition lawmakers here have put in motion their intentions to impeach President Yoon Suk Yeol. And on Press Perspective today, we delve into the growing political fallout of Korea's shortest martial law. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Thursday, December 5th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we continue the conversation about the political repercussions of Korea's shortest martial law in its history. For this, I have Thomas Maresca for American news agency UPI. Thomas, it's great to have you back.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
I also have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post here in the studio as well. Kelly, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Right, Kelly, we'll start with you. Let's begin with the opposition's call for President Yoon Suk Yeol's impeachment. What is the latest on that front?
Well, he's certainly headed towards impeachment proceedings. On Wednesday, 6 opposition parties submitted a motion to impeach him. We're looking at a vote that potentially could be as soon as Friday, maybe Saturday. We'll have to see what happens. Impeachment is definitely not certain. You know, there needs to be a 2/3 majority from lawmakers in order to pass it, as well as it has to go through the Constitutional Court. And, you know, members of the Min Sunhee party or the Democratic Party in South Korea, some of them are, you know, more so waiting for him to resign, as that's what they want. So we'll have to see what's going on. But he's certainly going to face the option that he may be another South Korean president who has been impeached.
Right, the vote on the impeachment bill will take place this week, of course. And before we delve any further, Thomas, for the sake of our foreign viewers, could you walk us through the process of a presidential impeachment here in South Korea?
Yes, so as Kelly said, you know, the impeachment motion was entered into the parliament, and then the vote has to be held within a period of 24 to 72 hours. The latest I've heard is that the leader of the Democratic Party opposition wants the vote to be held on Saturday evening, probably. So for that vote, there needs to be a 2/3 margin for the impeachment to be passed or proceed. And so that would be 200 out of the 300 seats in the National Assembly, of which 192 are controlled by the Democratic Party and the other opposition parties. So we're really looking at an 8-vote swing from the president's People Power Party if the impeachment is going to go through. If it does go through, then Yoon would be immediately relieved of his duties. The Prime Minister, Han Duck-soo, would step in as acting president, and then the Constitutional Court would need to take up the case within 6 months. I don't know if that's a law or just the sort of custom of it, but and then it would make a ruling on whether Yoon is guilty of the crimes that he's being, been accused of or charged from the impeachment, and whether those are serious enough to warrant the impeachment. So that needs 6 of 9 justices to pass that vote. And right now, actually, on the Constitutional Court, there are 3 vacancies, so there are only 6 justices. So I think it's unclear whether they would want to bring some more on to pass that vote. I don't think that's known. So, and then if he is removed by the court, then an election would be held. That would have to be within 60 days. And then, so that's basically it. And if he does resign, the Prime Minister would take over as well, and then an election would have to be held in 60 days also.
Right, and Kelly, this latest call for impeachment, it's not the first for South Korea, right?
It's definitely not. I mean, most South Koreans remember what happened less than a decade ago with former President Park Geun-hye. For people who don't know, back in 2016 and 2017, there was a major movement to impeach Park. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people gathering in Gwanghwamun Square in these very vibrant protests to, oust her from power over charges of corruption and abuse of power, influence peddling from a friend and a close aide. And that, ended in her impeachment. Her imprisonment, she was sentenced to 24 years, although she was pardoned during the pandemic. So this is definitely something that, I don't want to say South Koreans are used to it, but they're familiar with it. Young people probably remember that time. I was here in 2017. I remember reporting on the initial impeachment proceedings and the protests. It was a really interesting time of political upheaval. I think, this moment is similar. People are definitely looking for that kind of protest spirit. I know there's been a lot of response from international readers who are very interested in seeing these protests, including the candlelight protests at the National Assembly last night. But it's a different moment in history. I mean, it's a different president, different circumstances, but it definitely has echoes from the recent past, for sure.
Right. Thomas, does this latest political event here on the domestic front look to perhaps affect Korea's diplomatic endeavors? I mean, some have pointed out that this is a purely domestic issue and that it might affect Korea's image overseas, but its impact on its diplomatic agenda would be limited. What have you been hearing?
Well, I mean, you could say that it happened so fast, it came and went so fast that maybe the, shock waves or the repercussions are not being as strongly felt as if it had become like a full-blown constitutional crisis. But at the same time, I think it's already having pretty severe diplomatic reverberations. Just in terms of relationships with allies, I mean, the U.S. has come out and said that no one was made aware of the plan for this martial law decree. And now the voices from the Secretary of State and Deputy Secretary of State have been, fairly critical, calling it badly misjudged, deeply illegitimate process. And I think, it undermines the sense of trust. I mean, especially within this relationship that had grown so much closer under Yoon and the Biden administration. I mean, at the same time, the U.S. military here, the U.S. Forces Korea, also is apparently not made aware of the deployment of South Korean troops to the National Assembly. And I mean, that, I think, shakes the foundations of this close security relationship and has definitely caused alarm. I mean, not to mention there's the sense of, does that create a vulnerability, this lack of coordination where you've got North Korea next door? I mean, that's been raised as a question of how dangerous was that, or could that be again if we don't have this level of coordination? We have seen some fallout already. Just the uncertainty, like Sweden's prime minister canceled a visit, a Japanese parliamentary delegation that was supposed to come canceled. The U.S. has postponed meetings of the nuclear consultative group for indefinitely. Even the new Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba seems like he's not really committing to when he's going to come for a visit. So we've seen that sort of practical fallout. And then I think just in a much more broad sense, especially Yoon's, as much as his domestic agenda has been not very successful or popular, his foreign policy has probably been the strongest element of his presidency, and he's really moved to position South Korea as, the so-called global pivotal state, and he's really moved to sort of push a values-based diplomacy approach and stand for liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. And I think this type of move just undercuts that so much. So I think there's going to be a fallout from that as well.
Right, and while there are pundits like Thomas was saying about U.S. officials who do believe that this was a poorly planned attempt to perhaps assert authority, others, Kelly, are saying that the imposing of martial law by the president and then the eventual lifting of that mandate after a parliamentary veto was in itself a demonstration of Korea's democracy. What are your thoughts? Would you say that that is the prevailing sentiment among those watching this event from the outside?
That's a good question. I think that's certainly one way to look at it. As someone who was there Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, it was interesting because it wasn't an eventual lift. It was like a 6-hour imposition of martial law, or as some people are calling it, a 6-hour coup. And when I got there was a lot of rage, there was a lot of anger among protesters. And by the end, people were singing and cheering. I mean, there was still, of course, anger, but that's how quickly lawmakers were able to rush the building and swat down martial law with their vote, which is, definitely a testament, I think, to the strength of South Korean democracy at this time. And certainly protesters who were there were very proud of their fellow constituents for showing up in freezing temperatures, by the way. I mean, I literally could not type on my phone my articles because my fingers were so frozen stiff. So, I mean, for people to show up on a whim, on a moment's notice, and rally like that. I really think that they deserve their kudos as well. And I did see a lot of young people who showed up that said that, you know, this is something that they learned about in history books, and they wanted to see it for themselves. They almost couldn't believe it, and they felt like this was a pivotal moment of history, and this was their chance to do their civic duty. Those protests were, of course, not that large. I mean, it was thousands of people for sure, but given the circumstances that this was announced so late, I do think that that is kind of a testament to the spirit of the Korean protests, which is something that American audiences are certainly fascinated by. I think a lot of people don't know this, but many countries around the world have legal precedent to impose martial law. The United States is certainly one of them. And so, I mean, this isn't something that is impossible for other nations. And so the way that this was shot down quickly, I think, is pretty remarkable.
All right, and Kelly, thanks to your presence there. The Washington Post was really quick in its reporting of the situation here late Tuesday night into early Wednesday morning. Thomas, Bloomberg carried a opinion piece about the martial law event being a win for China and a problem for the U.S. Would you like to expand on this thread of thought?
Sure. Right. I read the piece you were mentioning. You know, it doesn't go too deeply into the details of it, but I think the basic premise is sort of to return to also what I was just saying about the diplomatic fallout. I mean, we've seen the South Korea, U.S., and Japan trilateral alliance, you know, strengthen quite a bit during this administration. And so now the level of uncertainty, perhaps lack of trust or faith in, you know, the Yoon administration as a partner can you know, be seen as weakening that alliance. And, you know, certainly it probably came together. I mean, if you look at sort of the Biden administration's general move towards building alliances, I mean, I think a lot of it was precipitated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but certainly within this region, especially, you know, the eye has been on China strongly by the U.S. And I think, you know, having this South Korea, Japan trilateral alliance, certainly part of that is to maybe act as, you know, some form of bulwark against whatever China's ambitions might be. And so, you know, this clearly is, you know, as mentioned before, you know, does raise questions of trust and reliability among the military as well as on the political front. So just in the weakening of that, you know, that you could see that as perhaps creating a sort of a vacuum that China could step into. Plus, you know, now we've got a new administration coming in Washington. The Trump administration is coming in next month, which is, you know, unpredictable to say the least, maybe unsettling is a better word as far as trying to determine what the foreign policy is going to be. And, you know, we know Trump has already shown, you know, much less interest in being an alliance sort of focused leader. We've got new leadership in Japan. And so, you know, as of next month, you know, depending on what happens with Yoon, you know, Yoon was in a position to be maybe the centerpiece of keeping this trilateral alliance strong, and now his future is in question with that, which is, you know, can certainly be seen as a question of, you know, the strength of that going forward. And also then if you consider what might happen if Yoon is impeached or steps down, there's a new election, and perhaps, you know, or it might seem likely that the Democratic Party would take power, you know, with Lee Jae-myung, who may bring, you know, or would be expected to bring a different foreign policy approach, you know, that might look to be less, you know, strongly in the camp of the U.S., more trying to go back to an older sort of position of sort of sitting on the fence or trying to navigate between China and the U.S. I think Lee Jae-myung has also, you know, spoken out about not getting involved in, say, the China-Taiwan Strait, you know, the situation there. So there's some sense that Lee Jae-myung may change the tenor of the relationship, and that could be seen as being in, you know, China's interest.
Right. Well, for now, the fate of the Yoon administration will be determined this coming weekend. Kelly, in its coverage, in CNN's coverage, that is, of the political events here, they describe Korea as having a robust but polarized democracy. Do you agree with that?
I think that's a pretty fair characterization. Robust, I mean, there's certainly a lot of legal, institutions in place to uphold democracy, as we saw this past week with a 6-hour window of martial law. Voter turnout in South Korea compared to other nations where there's a voluntary vote is pretty decent. The April general elections had a 67% voter turnout. People here tend to be pretty politically active. So in terms of robust, I think that's a fair characterization. Polarized as well, especially at this moment in time, and also throughout South Korean history. Right now, I mean, if you look at President Moon's administration, I mean, he was actually quite a popular president by polling standards. Near the end of his tenure, maybe people were, becoming more unhappy or discontent over economic issues, youth unemployment, how much he invested his resources in diplomacy with North Korea. But still, he was a pretty popular president, and then we saw a backswing where we elected Yoon, who is more conservative. And if you look at South Korean history, I mean, we tend to vacillate between left and right, administration to administration. Granted, it's a very young democracy. It's interesting right now because certainly politics are polarized maybe as much, if not more, than in the United States, but definitely as much, I think. And, this does not reflect well on the People Power Party and on, the idea that South Korea took a turn and elected someone so conservative. At the same time, though, the Democratic Party, its leader, Lee Jae-myung, he's someone that is a polarizing figure himself. He's highly revered. He's also highly despised, depending on who you're talking to. I mean, it's really not that different from when you look at Democrats versus Republicans in the United States. So I do think that CNN had a fair characterization. And, polarized is not a good thing, but it's good to have political debate. And I think one thing that I really enjoy about being a reporter in South Korea is that there's a very lively political scene, and I can't say that about every other modern G20 nation.
Right then, Thomas, here's the million-dollar question. How does the Yoon administration seek to survive this political blunder? That is the diction used by some foreign media outlets.
Right. Well, to be fair, I mean, it's not just the foreign media. I think that's calling it a political blunder. Even here in South Korea, Chosun Ilbo, a conservative newspaper, has written, kind of a relatively scathing editorial about the move, calling it, deeply troubling and saying Yoon failed to offer a convincing explanation as to why he suddenly declared law. So, certainly political figures have criticized it here and abroad as well. So I don't think it's just a foreign media characterization. As far as how he survives, I mean, you said it, that is the million-dollar question. I mean, the first thing is surviving the impeachment vote. And, the leader of the People Power Party, Han Dong-hoon, has said that he's going to try to rally the party to, not jump to the other side. Again, they need basically eight votes to pass this impeachment. So, that seems to be the at least what they're saying publicly, the People Power position to keep him from being impeached. So, if that happens, then, I don't know that that's the end of it, of course. I mean, there's obviously like a lot of public anger and outrage about it. I mean, I've seen there's just a Real Meter poll that came out, I think today, that said almost 75% of the public supports the impeachment motion against Yoon. So, he will have a hard time sort of repairing, his image. I really don't know how he does that. But maybe there's just something political. We were kind of chatting, Kelly and I were talking about it a little bit beforehand. Maybe there's some political motivation for his own party to keep him from being impeached, to keep him in power, because they may think, if a snap election is held, they're not going to be prepared to win. So it might almost be better in their interest. Some sort of political calculations like that may be the sort of thing. But as far as him to sort of returning to office, he was already deeply unpopular. This is clearly not going to help. So it's a tall order. I really don't have a good answer for how you do it.
I don't think a lot of people do at the moment, right? Kelly, we mentioned this earlier. The Washington Post was quick to cover President Yoon Suk Yeol's martial law declaration, and you braved the freezing weather conditions to be on site at the National Assembly Tuesday evening. What was the gist of your initial coverage, Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very fast evolution throughout the night. For me, when the announcement was first made, I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to believe. I was speaking with foreign correspondents as well as local journalists from all sorts of outlets. We weren't sure if, based on the decrees that were sent out, if we were risking arrest by going out in the field. There was some fake news circulating as well about an 11 p.m. curfew, and so people were afraid of, potentially being arrested just for being outside. And it felt, I know that domestic politics here have been heating up, and that Yoon has certainly faced a lot of opposition, especially after the 2022 Itaewon disaster. But it did feel a little out of the blue for this to happen. So I think there was an initial sense of shock and maybe even disbelief. Certainly that was the case among pretty much every protester or demonstrator I spoke with this week. They all virtually echoed that sentiment, that they didn't even necessarily know if what they read was true when they showed up to the National Assembly Tuesday night into Wednesday morning. When I was there, it was really, the atmosphere when I first showed up was kind of shocking for someone who's lived in South Korea the last 8 years. When I got out of the car, I saw black helicopters flying overhead. Throughout the night, we saw military vehicles, a tank that protesters tried to stop. I saw people cursing at the authorities, people, demanding that the gates to the National Assembly be open. There were moments where I wondered if there was going to be, some kind of low-level clash. I will say it was generally very peaceful, but it was tense. But as the night progressed and as lawmakers, overturned martial law, it kind of went into a more cheery, or at least proud, kind of synergistic, camaraderie type atmosphere. But there's still plenty of anger from my conversations with people this week and in the following protests. So it was like a very astonishing 6 hours. I think we use those words in a headline, and that's pretty much, as someone who was there, how I would characterize it.
Right. Thomas, you were also on site at the National Assembly on Tuesday night, and you were quick to follow up with the lifting of the martial law 6 hours later. Do tell us a bit about your coverage and the atmosphere there from your perspective. Yeah,
I think similar to what Kelly said, the whole thing happened so fast. Came as such a surprise. It was hard to believe, seeing the messages on my phone that this was actually happening in South Korea. And I didn't, there was, a sense, especially first arriving of, is something going to happen? There were massive, crowds were sort of massing at the gates, and there were these sort of pinch points that felt like, it could be a bit volatile. But, it didn't ever get to a point. I've been in places like large-scale protests in Hong Kong or somewhere in Thailand, and, it never felt like, the police are about to start shooting tear gas. And, so there was a bit of a different attitude around that. And then things just were changing so fast. It was only a couple of hours basically between the declaration of the decree of martial law and then the vote in the parliament to overturn it. It was so quick. So, there was that side of it. It just was happening so fast. But yeah, it was, one thing I noticed, there were certainly young people there, but a lot of the people that were there seemed to be a bit older, middle-aged and above. And I got this feeling of, maybe this is the generation that remembers in living memory, being under a military dictatorship, or, the last time there was martial law decreed, which was 1979 or 1980. So I think that was something where also drove the response that was it was so fast, the way people got out there. And it did seem like, to speak to the sort of robustness of the democracy too, there were these, the initial announcement was prohibiting public protest, and people just seemed to completely ignore that, and showed up. And yeah, some younger people that I talked to as well were saying like their father had told them about the past, and so they felt there was this definite sense of, immediate determination to respond to this, even though it was in the middle of the night, freezing cold. And then, I just had the sense it was so crazy that it all happened within the course of one night. It would have been very possible to have fallen asleep and woken up and not realized this entire martial law and then an overturning had happened during the night. So just, truly one of the most,
dramatic
strange as
events.
dramatic is a better word. Yeah, experiences
Dramatic
I've
events.
had covering here. Yeah.
Right, a 6-hour dramatic event here on the National Front Tuesday night until Wednesday morning. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thomas, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Kelly, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you so much.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Press Perspective. We return same time tomorrow with a greater focus on the public response to the recent political events here in South Korea. Do join us then.